power interface specification, conjured up by friends at Hewlett-Packard, Intel, Microsoft, Phoenix, the major BIOS vendor, and Toshiba. The revision 3 document, which I've had access to, or which I found, is from 2006 and some 600 pages. Among other things, for the configuration part is pretty simple. It specifies tables of what hardware is in the system, how much memory do you have, etc., etc. Nothing really spectacular. For the power part, it specifies a virtual machine which has its own bytecode. And this virtual machine runs in your BIOS. So outside the security controls of your operating system. Is it really outside the operating system? Yeah, at first they implemented it that way, but it turned out to be way too slow. The performance hit was, I've heard the number 5% performance lost because the ACPI virtual machine was implemented all in the BIOS. I'm sorry, I just remembered I forgot to plug my laptop in. There we go. This virtual machine, it moved into the operating system because of this performance hit. It was just unbearable to have 5% gone. And Linux started doing this in 2001. I've seen the number 90,000 lines of code in the Linux kernel to implement the ACPI virtual machine at present. And the good, or the fun, interesting part is that it still operates outside the operating system security model. It's how ACPI was designed to work, how it was designed to run, and it's the only way it really can work. So, yeah. And who is providing this ACPI bytecode? Well, it's in your BIOS. So it comes from the BIOS vendor. Okay, looking around, what's out there in this field? For the PC, there's really two options. There's BIOS. There are a few BIOS vendors left. Really only two big ones. That's Phoenix and that's AMI. They bought everyone else. It started out in 1978 with a tape player I/O abstraction. So there were two brands of tape machines, and there were a couple of different PCs. And in order to talk to the different tape drives, you had to drive them a bit differently. So the BIOS was implemented to abstract the differences. And that was really all it did to bootstrap the system. In 2009, it's an API with well over 100 function calls. A lot of stuff that can be done if you ask the BIOS. Mostly real mode code. I listened to a presentation by one of the commercial BIOS vendors, and they said that, well, our code base, it has 4,300 files in it, all assembler files. But they said it's modular, so it's really easy to work with. I don't know, I would probably prefer a bit fewer files myself. That's the BIOS. It works the way it always has. Then there's the new guy, that's EFI. Originally started by Intel. It's almost an operating system. It has its own network stack. It has support for timers. It's really modular compared to the BIOS, which is just one big lump. It's possible to download a development kit called Core from the web. It's BSD licensed. About 250 megabytes, and compare that with Linux, which is maybe 50 megabytes. EFI is claimed to be open, and in fact I've heard that the BIOS vendors, they were really scared of EFI when it was first started by Intel, because they thought, oh, okay, now open source firmware, now we're not going to have any market for our products anymore. But in fact, the open part of EFI is really just the foundation, and the BIOS vendors, they're all using that foundation, and they're building adding building blocks onto that. So they still have their products. That worked out well for them, but it's not so nice for us because they make all their products closed. Because it's BSD licensed, that's okay to do. But still, I would prefer an open alternative. That's it on the PC, and of course there's Coreboot. There are some related projects. Maybe you've heard about Grub and Lilo. I guess many of you are using either of them. They are bootloaders, and they relate to this field, but they run after the firmware is done. So first we have Coreboot or BIOS or EFI, and then we move to a bootloader, which is started by the BIOS or the firmware, and the bootloader is responsible for starting up the operating system. There are some other options like Redboot, U-Boot, and PMON, and there's also PMON 2000 for the Lungson processor and some MIPS processors, but they're really not so much for x86 architecture. They're more popular. I know U-Boot can be made to run on x86, and maybe someone is using it already, but other than that, they're all for smaller systems. Otherwise, they have the same function. They initialize the hardware, and they get the operating system started. So I said Coreboot is a BIOS replacement. And we talked a bit about how the BIOS works, how it's split into the hardware init and the operating system start. And Coreboot does things differently. I think much better and at least very differently. Coreboot only does the first part, the hardware initialization, and then Coreboot is finished. Coreboot doesn't run anymore. After the hardware initialization, there's a separate program which has to take over and do whatever should come next in this system. And we call that program a payload. Coreboot, the payload with the Coreboot, it can do whatever it wants. It can start an operating system. It can be a utility, some kind of application. There's really no limit to what can be done in the payloads. You're the only software running in the system. You have full control. Many times it is a bootloader because you want to maybe start an operating system. Coreboot and the payload, we put those two together in the Coreboot build process, and then the result is flashed into the BIOS flash chip on the main board. So out with the BIOS and enter Coreboot and payload. What are all these payloads then? Or what payload